Please welcome Dr. Hicks to introduce our keynote.
Thank you. I'm also a former, not former, I'm also have been known as a Baptist preacher, so I too run to pulpits. I just asked, I wanted to ensure that I had the pronunciation of Heidi's name, even though I'm not here to introduce him, but I can't wait to have dialogue with him. I moved here from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and was a visiting professor in the African American Studies Center at UPenn. But I'd love to talk to you about the oldest ongoing freestanding farmers market in the country, which is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He's looking at me like I want to challenge him to make sure that it's the oldest, but their claim to fame that it was the oldest was that it was the oldest. Which gets me to my interest here. Fred wanted me to give a little sense before I introduced our first speaker about why I'm interested in food justice. As he mentioned, I'm teaching a class. Several of my students are here. I'm also on the steering committee of the Religion and Food section of the American Academy of Religion. I have written a chapter in a forthcoming book called The Way of Food, Religion and Eating in North America, where I theorize through a chapter called The Unusual Feast, African American religious life, through a metaphor of gumbo, which I do a lot of every year. I'm also working on expanding that work into a full book that is tentatively entitled Sacred Gastronomy, Religion, Food, and Identity and Justice in African American Life. And so I'm here because I'm very interested in these issues. I almost find it not amusing, but it is interesting, the absurdity of this gathering. And by that I mean, it's absurd that we have to gather to talk about supplying human beings with healthy food, right? That I recall growing up in Los Angeles, California, with a Colfax, Louisiana grandmother. And we snacked on oranges and fresh roasted peanuts and apples, all the things that now I have to force my children to snack on. 2 out of 3 are working, the other one I'm still working on. But again, the reason we are here is for a very significant cause of justice. And my hope is, as I mill over all of the work that I'm doing, I'm concerned with kind of the cultural intersections of food culture, tradition, identity, stereotypes, and politics as it relates to food. But here I'm, along with many of you today, just here as a learner, as one who wants to soak in the knowledge that we will gain, and one who wants to create further dialogue with those who will be leading us today. So I'm very, very honored and happy to be here, and extremely doubly honored to introduce our first speaker this morning. Malik Yakini is a founder and executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which operates a 7-acre farm in Detroit. Along with this network, he has spearheaded efforts to establish the Detroit Food Policy Council, which he also chaired. Yakini was a member of the Michigan Food Policy Council and serves on the steering committee of Undoing Racism in the Detroit Food System. From 1990 to 2011, he was executive director of the, is it Durama? In Saroma Institute Public School Academy, one of Detroit's leading African-centered schools. Yakini was honored as Administrator of the Year by the Michigan Association of Public School Academics in 2006, and served on the board of directors at the Timbuktu Academy of Science and Technology from 2004 to 2011. He He is also CEO of Black Star Education Management. Yakini is dedicated to working towards identifying and alleviating the impact of racism and white privilege in the food system and contributing to the development of international food sovereignty movement. He has presented at numerous national conferences on food justice and the implementing of community food security practices. Yakini is also featured in the book Blacks Living Green and the movie Urban Roots, and is currently a food and community fellow for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed first speaker, Mr. Malik Yakini.
Good morning, Winston-Salem. How's everyone doing? It's such an honor to be here. And I always begin by giving thanks and praise to the Creator. And we had such a wonderful homily by Reverend Rivers this morning. But I just want to continue on that same note, because for me this work is a spiritual work. And in many ways I see this as my calling. So it's not just something I do because I decided to do it, but I'm doing the work that I was put on earth to do. So I always want to start by kind of putting that forward, putting that platform forward, because for me this is a spiritual work. I also want to acknowledge my ancestors, both those in my personal bloodline, who I'm indebted to, and also those ancestors of African American people collectively, who created much of the wealth upon which the United States and the Western world is built. I'd like to thank Fred for inviting Haile and I here today, and it's been a pleasure spending some time with him over the last 2 days, and I want to acknowledge my brother Haile Johnston, who's doing wonderful work in Philadelphia, and it's been a pleasure, great pleasure and honor to spend time with him over the last 2 days as well. And I'd like to acknowledge my brother Maurice Smalls, who moved here recently from Cleveland. Where are you, Maurice? Stand up so people can see you. And if you don't know him, this brother is a master gardener. He just, in fact, you have such a treasure. It's Cleveland's loss, but North Carolina's gain, that he decided to move here. But he's doing wonderful work in Cleveland, and is now here, and is a wonderful resource that I would highly recommend you get to know him. I want to bring you greetings from a couple of organizations, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and the Detroit Food Policy Council, as well as the thousands of people who are involved in the urban agriculture movement and food system work in the city of Detroit. And I always acknowledge those people because although I am a spokesperson, I'm the person standing before you, there's lots and lots of people in the trenches in Detroit doing very important work who don't get the opportunity to travel around the country and talk to people. And so I don't want people to mistake that the person whose face you see or the person who's the spokesperson is necessarily the one who's making the work move forward. I'm contributing to that, but this is a collective work. And so I want to acknowledge all of those who are doing that work, again, whose faces you don't see. I think I want to start, often when I do presentations, I kind of have an idea of what I'm going to do, but I try to read the energy in the room and kind of see, what the vibration is, so to speak. And then I kind of play off of that. So I was kind of taking notes as I was sitting there and listening to the speakers that came before me. And I think what I like to do is start with a story. You all like stories? Yes. And this story you might have heard before, but this is, actually I call this a classic story retold. And the name of the story is The Little Red Hen. Now this is a participatory story. So, I know we have many people in the faith community here today, and within the Black church, there's this tradition we call call and response. You know about that, Reverend? Okay, I thought you knew something about that. And so this is going to require you to participate. And by the way, let me say this throughout my talk that I encourage call and response. In fact, it helps me know that you're paying attention, even if your response is negative. If your response is to throw something at me, at least I have some response. I know that you're engaged. But you can feel free to say amen or right on, or anything that you might feel moved to say, so that we have an interactive time here this morning. So this is the Little Red Hen, a classic story retold. Once upon a time, in a village in Africa, a hen scratched about the yard until she uncovered some grains of wheat. She called to her neighbors and said, "If we plant this wheat, we can have bread to eat. Who will help me plant it?" "Not I," said the cow. "I thought slavery was over." Let me just explain that for just a minute. I found in working with African Americans and trying to encourage our people to become involved in agricultural work that many people have a frame of reference that is rooted in our experience in slavery. And so, in fact, usually within 15 minutes of working with black youth in a garden, there's some reference to slavery. "You're working me like a slave." "Not I," said the goat. "It probably won't grow anyway." "Not I," said the duck. "I'm much too busy." "Not I," said the lamb. "I don't do dirt." "Then I will," said the little red hen, and this is where you have to join in. You say, "And she did." And she did. After a few months, the wheat grew tall and ripened in the golden grains reaching up towards the sun. Beneficial insects and beautiful birds began to return to the village. The little red hen again called to her neighbors, "Who will help me harvest this wheat?" "Not I," said the cow. "My stomach's ache." "Not I," said the goat. "I really don't get involved with groups." "Not I," said the duck. "I have a wheat allergy." "Not I," said the lamb. "My favorite rapper, Young Shepherd, is performing at a free concert this afternoon." This is corny stuff.
And we're laughing.
"Then I will harvest it myself," said the little red hen.
And she did.
The hen carried the wheat back to her house and asked her neighbors, "Who will help me grind the wheat into flour?" "Not I," said the cow. "I already have 2 jobs." "Not I," said the goat. "I don't have anyone to watch my kids." "Not I," said the duck. "I'm trying to get paid." "Not I," said the lamb. "You run a game, hen. You trying to pull the wool over my eyes." "Then I will grind it myself," said the little red hen.
And she did.
After resting from the exhausting work of grinding the grain, the little red hen made one last attempt to solicit the help of her neighbors. "Who will help me make this flour into dough and bake the bread?" She was met with the usual litany of excuses. "Not I," said the cow. "Chewing cud takes all the energy I've got." "Not I," said the goat. "My kids have music lessons." "Not I," said the duck. "My cousin Donald and his family are visiting from out of town." "Not I," said the lamb. "I'm studying for my real estate license." "Then I will bake the bread myself," said the little red hen.
And she did.
As the aroma of the freshly baked bread drifted into the village, the little red hen's neighbors began to gather outside of her door. "Who will help me eat this bread?" asked the little red hen. "I will," said the cow. "I will," said the goat. "I will," said the duck. "I will," said the lamb. "No, you won't," the little red hen said. "None of you practiced Ujima, collective work and responsibility." However, my beloved neighbors, I didn't grind all of the grain. I started a seed bank to have wheat for next year. Here's a handful of grain for each of you. And she sent them packing. As the little red hen sat down to enjoy her still warm bread with honey from the beehives that her friend Abba had maintained at a local farm, the goat, the cow, the duck, and the lamb called a meeting to form an organic, sustainable farming collective. The next season, they all worked together to plant, harvest, and grind their wheat and bake bread. There was plenty for all. They donated some to the animals who were homeless or sick, and sold the surplus at farmers markets in neighboring villages. Their village continued to prosper. Eventually, they started manufacturing farming and baking equipment, and the little red hen was elected chief of the village council. That's a really corny story. But I hope there were maybe some lessons that could be extracted from that. It was intended to be humorous. And sometimes I like starting a talk with humor because this is really a serious subject that we're talking about. Sometimes it just kind of loosens people up. Especially, you know, I started out because I'm from Detroit. Detroit is like 80-something% African American. So most of the time I've spoken to groups, it's been all black groups. And so lately I've had the opportunity to speak to majority white groups and mixed groups, and I'm talking about racism, and these are really hard discussions. So I found, like with white people, if you get them laughing first, then you talk about racism. It tends to work a little better. And I think I want to tell you another story too. This is a personal story. And this is really about my own personal food transformation. And again, I'm telling these stories because I hope there's some lessons in them that you can extract. And then I'll tell you about some of the work that we're doing in Detroit. So this story is called Guts, a story of personal transformation. I was born in January of 1956 in Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. My parents were postal workers who worked at the long abandoned Roosevelt Annex postal station. They took me home from the hospital to a small apartment which is now demolished on Collingwood in Detroit's notorious 12th Street. Anybody know about 12th Street in Detroit? No? That's the place that you can get everything, all the wrong stuff you can get there. Drugs, prostitution, all kinds of vice. That was what 12th Street was known for. After my mother, who breastfed me, went back to work, I was most often in the care of my maternal grandmother and grandfather, who, like many Negroes, had come north in the 1920s to industrial cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Gary. My grandfather, Jesse Odom, who had been trained as a printer in Brinkley, Arkansas, at Brinkley Academy, a school founded by his father, Sandy Odom, who had just years earlier been run off his land in Marion, Arkansas, by the whites in that town and banished from his home. My grandparents operated a printing shop on West Warren in Detroit. Their house was upstairs from the printing shop. They worked very hard. They stayed up late at night to meet deadlines, and in the midst of that still raised 3 children. My grandmother would break from setting type on the linotype machine. Anybody know what a linotype machine is? For the younger people, there was a time when there were no computers or word processors and anything like that. And they set type on these pieces of lead, molten lead, and they would put the pieces of molten lead in frames in order to print newspapers and magazines and things like that. And so my grandmother operated this linotype machine. She would take breaks from setting type on the linotype machine to prepare meals. She brought her southern upbringing to the kitchen. Pots of beans and greens were supplemented with neck bones, ham hocks, and soft pork. At holiday times, we'd have turkey, ham, and chitlins. She could make something out of nothing. If there was no syrup for pancakes, she boiled water, added some sugar, and we had syrup. Y'all know about that? Her pies were my favorite. My mother learned to cook from her mother and found a way, in spite of working a full-time job at the post office, to prepare meals daily for my brother and I. She prepared green beans, mashed potatoes, cornbread, pork chops, roast beef, navy beans, greens, broccoli, yellow squash, potato salad, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, spaghetti, tuna casserole, soups, pot pies, and a host of other delights. There was one food that I loved more than all others: chitlins. Y'all didn't hear the sister in front. She said, "Now you're talking." She gonna be mad at me by the time the story is over. After an extensive cleaning ritual, the pig intestines were boiled for hours on a small stove in the basement. I love to eat mine with Louisiana red hot sauce. And I have to add that oftentimes on New Year's Day we would have them on paper plates and the grease would be soaking. Fast forward to 1969. I was a 13-year-old growing up in Detroit that 2 years earlier had experienced the bloodiest of the urban rebellions that swept across America in the long, hot summers of the 1960s. My 8th grade social studies teacher played the entire LP recording of Malcolm X's Message to the Grassroots, recorded at Detroit's King Solomon Baptist Church in 1963. Hearing Malcolm's historical understanding, clear logic, and unapologetic pro-black stance had a profound and lasting impact on me in many ways. I listened intently as Malcolm talked about what he called the 2 types of slaves: the house slave and the field slave. Malcolm said there were always more Negroes in the field than there were Negroes in the house. The Negroes in the field caught hell. He ate leftovers. In the house, they ate high up on the hall. The Negro in the field didn't get nothing but what was left of the insides of the hall. They call them chitlins nowadays. In those days, they call them what they were: guts. That's what you were, a gut eater. And some of y'all are still gut eaters. Well, needless to say, to my chitlin-loving 13-year-old mind, my world was rocked. For the first time, I thought about the food I ate within a social and historical context. I had never thought about food before, other than whether or not I liked the way it tasted and when I could get some more. My consciousness about food was further expanded by reading Black Panther Party newspaper stories about their free breakfast programs and the root causes of hunger and poverty. I slowly began to change what I ate. By 1971, I had stopped eating pork, including my beloved chitlins. I began to learn how to fast for first 1, then 3, then 7, then 10, then 21 days in order to develop self-discipline. By 1975, I had become mostly vegetarian, although I continued to eat fish. By 1983, as I tuned in more and more to the impact of various foods on my body, I had decided to give up dairy products, eggs, and fish, becoming what I later learned was called a vegan. As my food consciousness grew, I became more and more concerned about my food being organic, fair, and local. And so that's, again, just a little background on me, kind of a food biography, but within that there's some lessons. And for African Americans in particular, many of our food traditions are rooted in the experience of our enslavement. And while I give thanks for the foods that we had to survive during that time period, the reality is we's free now. And so we don't have to be locked into that paradigm. And so we have to change our food culture and begin to adopt a food culture that allows us to have optimal health. So with that, I want to segue into the work that we're doing in Detroit, because for me, the work really began on a very personal level. I didn't know anything about a food movement, and I had never heard the term food desert, but I knew that food had an impact personally. It had an impact on my health, it had an impact on how I felt, it had an impact on my ability to pay attention and to retain information. And so that was really my entree into what we now call the food movement. For a number of years, I ran a school in Detroit, in sort of an institute. And in 2000, we started doing some pretty serious organic gardening with the children at the school. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, because at that school, we were concerned about teaching African American youth to have a sense of responsibility to their community. And we were concerned about making sure that they were rooted in their own historical and cultural experience. But also, we were concerned about something which was a little more subtle. And that is the fact that we realize that nowadays children spend a lot of time indoors. And that's for various reasons. Sometimes it's because going outdoors is dangerous. You know, when I was a young child, we stayed outdoors all day long. Our parents would have to call us in for dinner, and that's during the time when families still ate dinner together. But we'd stay outside as long as we could until the street lights came on, and then that's when we'd have to come back inside. But now, our children stay inside and play video games, and also stay inside to avoid the danger that exists in communities like Detroit and other communities throughout the United States. So we realize that children, and for that matter, adults can't be whole and can't really fully commune with the spiritual energy that runs through the universe if we spend all of our time in buildings and all of our time on concrete. And that there's something special and an intuitive spiritual understanding that develops when you begin to work with the earth. And so on the surface level, the cover story was that we're teaching children how to grow food in order to help make their communities more self-reliant. But the deeper reason for us doing this gardening was that we wanted to provide experiences for children outdoors and to have them commune with nature and become more in touch with their spirituality. And so we continued doing that work for a number of years after school, and the interest grew and grew and grew until in 2006 we started an organization that we call the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And we've done quite a bit of work in the last 7 years, which has had some impact on our community and which people have taken note of throughout the country and to some extent throughout the world. So I want to talk to you about the work that we're doing in Detroit, and then I'll conclude, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions. So wherever I go, I'm always very proud to represent the city of Detroit. In fact, many people from Detroit, we have this kind of this love for the place that we come from. And Detroit gave many gifts to the world, including the Model T Ford and the assembly line style of production, which actually might be a mixed blessing, given the impact that the internal combustion engine has had on the environment. But nonetheless, the automobile has transformed society in many ways which are positive and perhaps in some ways which are not so positive. Detroit gave Vernon's ginger ale to the world. Betty Bebop Carter. Anybody know about Betty Bebop Carter? Oh, y'all got to do some study. And of course, the Motown sound. Those guys right there, when I was growing up, those guys right there, they were my role models, the Temptations. Oh, y'all know about that. However, in 2013, Detroit also reflects much of what is wrong in what we now call post-industrial American cities. And this picture really, in a sense, it captures what's going on in Detroit right now. In the background, you see this structure which is called the Renaissance Center, which is now the world headquarters for the General Motors Corporation. In the foreground, you see what used to be the Packard automobile plant, which has been abandoned since the 1950s, but is still standing, an abandoned structure, this hulking structure that has been burned out several times, that is a trap for drug addicts and for all kinds of illicit activity. And so in a sense, this picture really illustrates what's happening in Detroit. You have kind of this corporate wealth, and you have the majority of the people living in poverty and suffering. In 1950, Detroit had a population of 2 million. Beginning in the late 1950s, as restrictive covenants on housing were relaxed and blacks were able to move into various neighborhoods, we had what we call white flight. That white folks, when black folks would move in the neighborhood, about a year or two, they'd be gone. In fact, the neighborhood that I live in, I've been living in the same house for about 53 years, which is highly unusual, but it's given me a lens to view the transformation of my own community. So when I first moved there were little white kids that I played with, and I never went inside their house, as I recall. But we played out in the yards and what have you for about the first year or two. After the second year, they were all gone. And that's pretty much what happened throughout Detroit. And so the white people would leave Detroit and go to the mostly white suburbs surrounding Detroit. And of course, take with them their tax dollars. After the rebellion in 1967, or what some people call a riot, we had massive white flight. Like 10,000 people or so, were leaving monthly in the months following the 1967 rebellion. And then we saw, following the residents movement, we saw many of the businesses moving also to this ring of suburbs surrounding Detroit. So that we have currently some of the wealthiest counties in the country surrounding Detroit, and some of the poorest zip codes in the country in the city of Detroit. Also, in more recent times, we've had black middle class flight. That as black folks get more and more money, they no longer want to be subjected to conditions that many Detroiters are subjected to, and they get their hat and get up too. And so now we have a population, according to the 2010 census, of about 713,000 people, 81% of whom are African American. Consistently, Detroit's unemployment rate is twice the national average. Our current mayor, Dave Bing, says that in some neighborhoods, the real estimate is probably closer to 50%. Between 1970 and 2000, there were 161,000 dwellings demolished. Many of those houses, again, because of this flight from the city. And we have thousands of other abandoned buildings that are awaiting demolition. Currently, there's 103,000 vacant lots in the city of Detroit. 60% of those are owned by the city government itself. So on one level, we have this tremendous blight in Detroit, but on the other hand, we have this tremendous opportunity, because now we can reimagine what our city will become. And we can reimagine the role that agriculture and green spaces play in an urban area. In 2007, well, in fact, let me back up just a minute and say that when I grew up in Detroit in the 1960s, there were at least 7 national chain supermarkets in the city. In almost any neighborhood in the city, you were within walking distance of a full-service national chain supermarket. As of 2007, when Farmer Jack closed its last stores in Detroit, there are no national chain supermarkets in a city of 713,000 people. Some people, as Dr. Quant pointed out to us earlier, use the term food desert to describe that lack of access to food. I don't really like the term food desert myself, but sometimes people use that. I don't have a big argument with it, but whatever we want to call it, food desert, food swamp, we certainly have a food access problem. And she has given you the stats for this locale, and you can go to communities, both urban and rural communities throughout the United States, and we'll see similar things happening. Something that's not often talked about is that 40,000 Detroit residents have their water shut off. And so it's almost ludicrous to talk about food security if people don't have running water. Now also, in all fairness, I have to tell you that there's a burgeoning business in Detroit where after the water department comes and shuts people's water off, about 15 minutes, the brothers roll up in a van and say, for $25, we'll cut it back on. And I always have to tell people, I don't actually know any of those people who cut the water back on or who have gotten their water cut back on, but I hear that happens. In a word, Detroit is food insecure. In fact, Mari Gallagher, a researcher out of Chicago, did a study in 2007 called Examining the Impact of Food Deserts on Public Health in Detroit. And according to her research, which by the way, if you Google Mari Gallagher, go to her website, the entire report is available. You can download it and read it for yourself. But according to her definition of a food desert, which is basically that residents live the residents live closer to what she calls fringe food locations, convenience stores, or what we call in Detroit party stores, stores that sell primarily alcohol, cigarettes, lottery tickets, sugary beverages, potato chips, those kinds of things, than they do to a supermarket. a grocery store. And so most Detroit residents, according to her research, more than 550,000 of the 713,000 people in Detroit live in an area that she defines as a food desert. And so this has had tremendous health impact in the city of Detroit. We have rates of diabetes that are off the chart. We have rates of childhood and adult obesity that are off the chart. We have rates of cancer that are off the chart, and many of these things are controllable by diet. I want to talk to you about the response of the organization that I lead, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. As I mentioned, we were founded in 2006, and we were founded for 6 reasons. One, to promote and influence public policy, because we realize that although we advocate what we call community self-determination, that is that people in neighborhoods have to take their own destiny in their hands and make changes on their own behalf without relying on government or corporations, that we have the capacity to shape our own reality. Although we strongly advocate that, we also understand that government plays a role and government has to be held accountable. And that we need policy that promotes good health and promotes good access to food. Our second reason for being formed was to promote urban agriculture. Because we think that is one of the solutions. It's not the entire solution, but it's one of the solutions to the lack of food access in places like Detroit, particularly because we have such a great amount of land which is not being used. We have examples such as in Havana, Cuba, where as a result of what they call the special period when the Soviet Union collapsed, which was their main benefactor, they had to really figure out how to feed their population. Now, more than 80% of the food consumed in Havana is produced in that city. And so we know that we have models and we have the potential for producing a great amount of food that's consumed in Detroit, right in Detroit. But I want to say that we're not under the illusion that because we can produce much more food than we're producing now in Detroit, that that's going to replace the need for rural farmers. And that we think that there need to be connections between folks in urban areas and rural farmers, and we need to develop some connections that perhaps in the past haven't been made because of race and class and other issues like that. There's some things that we all have in common, and we need to see what those common interests are and figure out how we work together to make these things happen. Our third reason for forming was to encourage cooperative buying. One of the things about American society and this capitalist system that we live in is it really encourages individualism. Let me just ask a question. How many people in the room use toilet paper? Throw your hands up. Well, you know, in every part of the world, they don't use toilet paper. You know, I was in Ghana in 1995, and I met some friends, and I was visiting with them, and I told them I had to use the restroom. They said, well, you know, go on out to the back. And so there was a little shack back there, and I had to kick some chickens out of it to get into it. And I got through, there was no toilet paper, but there was a little pot of water. And so toilet paper is not a universal thing. But anyway, so typically what happens is that each one of us go to the store and we buy maybe a 4-pack of toilet paper. And that costs anywhere from, on the low end, 99 cents to, if you want the high end, you know, the soft double ply and all that, you might pay $2, $3 for it. Well, what if instead of each family going out and buying a 4-pack of toilet paper, we all band together and we bought a truckload of toilet paper and we got it at the same price the supermarket got it from? Then we can cut out a lot of the cost. And so that's the principle of cooperative buying, that if you're able to increase your buying power, you can reduce cost. And so that's one of the principles our organization stands on. 4, we were started to promote healthy eating habits. 5, to facilitate mutual support and collective action among our members. And 6, to encourage young people to go into food-related careers. Because we understand that in any movement, that it has to be intergenerational. You know, I mentioned that I'm a child of the 1960s, and I was a young radical. I'm still radical for that matter, but I was a young radical, and many of us labored under the misconception in the 1960s that the revolution was about to happen, right? In the next 6 months or so, it was getting ready to go down. And everything was going to be better after that. It was really naive. You know, we didn't understand that this is an intergenerational process, that meaningful transformation happens slowly. And so we understand that in order to sustain this movement, that we can't have all people with a lot of gray hair and a beard and their hair doing it, that we need young people who see the value in this work and who are engaged in the work in order to make this movement sustainable. There are many, many people doing urban agriculture work in Detroit. Most of them are young whites, and they're young, well-meaning whites, and many of them are my friends. But the problem with that is that because we live in a society that gives favor and gives advantage to people who have white skin, and also suggests to white people, subtly usually now, that they're superior to others. And that message comes across in various different ways. It comes across in advertising, it comes across through the media, it comes across in the history books in schools, where the history of people from Western Europe is the dominant narrative, and the history of people of African descent and people of Asian descent and people from the various native populations of the Western Hemisphere are marginalized. They're kind of footnotes to the main story. And so what that suggests is that really what's most important is these white people who came from England and Spain and France and Portugal. That's what's most important. And oh yes, there were Native Americans here too, and there were Africans who were enslaved, but that's not really the main narrative. And so in many ways, the society suggests to us that being white is superior to being a person of color. So the problem is that when young, well-meaning whites come into communities of color, if they have not gone through a transformative process to divest themselves of the vestiges of that kind of thinking, they bring it with them. And they come in such a way, many times suggesting that they have the answer for these communities. And in reality, we know that in communities of color, we have this rich legacy of knowledge. In fact, it's kind of ludicrous to me to hear young whites coming into black communities, they go teach us about farming, right? It's like, come on now. We've been doing that ever since. So the thing that distinguishes our group from many of the other groups doing this work in Detroit is our group is representative. It grew organically out of the community. It's representative of the community that's being served. We didn't come in, we didn't parachute in to do this work, we lived in. And so in many ways we're doing the work for ourselves and our families and our extended families. So we think that the most effective movements are those that grow organically out of the people that they're designed to serve. We do several things. We have a youth program which is called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program. It's currently serving about 175 children in 2 schools in Detroit and 1 church-related facility. And in that program, we teach young people about sustainable agriculture. We teach them about some of the downsides of the current industrial food system that provides most of our food. We teach them about nutrition and healthy eating. They're able to create school gardens, and they're able to begin to think critically about the food access issues in their own neighborhoods. We have a buying club called the Ujamaa Food Co-op Buying Club, which right now is a once-a-month club that functions on this principle of cooperative buying that I described to you earlier, where we have partnered with a major national food distributor, and our members are able to go online and place an order once a month, and then we have a truck that pulls up to the building that we operate out of every 4 weeks, and we unload and we divide people's orders up and people come pick it up. So that way we're able to eliminate a lot of the middle layers that create additional costs when you go to a traditional grocery store. So we think it's important not only that we address the issue of food access, but also that we address the issue of how food is distributed. And we're concerned, frankly, about empowering communities. We're concerned not only with having access to food, but we're concerned that in the process of providing greater access to food, the communities are able to build wealth and empowerment and a greater sense of controlling their own destiny. We also have a lecture series that's co-sponsored by the Detroit Public Library called What's for Dinner? And we realized that even if we were able to change the food access situation immediately, if we could snap our fingers and all of a sudden, you know, everyone had access to good food, that would not necessarily result in people's eating habits being different. Because we've lost so much of our food culture. You know, many people now either eat primarily, and maybe this isn't the case here, I'm speaking from my experience, but eat primarily out of fast food restaurants or eat food in various packages that they stick in a microwave oven, or foods that come in styrofoam containers and boxes and cans. And so, after having 30, 40 years of people eating like that, you know, the way my grandmother cooked, a lot of that has been lost. I was talking to the sister at the table, and she was talking about the wonderful church garden that they had, the bountiful harvest they had this year. And she mentioned, you know, they had eggplants, and they were giving eggplants to some people, and people said, what do I do with this? Right? I had the exact same experience in Detroit with the community garden for our school. One of our neighbors let us use water for the garden. So in exchange, we brought her some vegetables, we gave her the eggplant. She was like, oh. Right? So we've lost a lot of that food culture. So this struggle isn't just to provide access, but it's also to restore part of our foodways and our food culture. And so this lecture series helps to do that. And then we're involved in an effort called Uprooting Racism, Planting Justice. It used to be called Undoing Racism in the Detroit food system, which addresses these issues of racial inequity in the food system. There's an excellent report that was issued by a group called the Applied Research Center. And this is also available online. I would highly recommend that you get a copy of this, which is called The Color of Food. And it tells that in every sector of the food chain, that whites are paid more, that whites tend to have management positions much more than people of color. And we know also that there's a significant racial component to the problem of food access. The reality is part of the reason that supermarkets don't move into urban communities such as the one I live in is because of race. It's not the only factor, but that's certainly a factor. And so we think that it's very important that if we're going to have food justice in American society, that we unflinchingly address the issue of racism. We have to have racial justice in order to have food justice. In fact, the reality is we have to have social justice generally in order to have food justice. And these ideas are not separated. They're really intrinsically linked together. You can't have one without the other. Our main project, our most labor-intensive project, and the one that we are probably most known for is D-Town Farm. D-Town Farm is located in a city-owned park. We're currently on 7 acres. We started with 2 acres. We have a 10-year license agreement with the city of Detroit to use this land. And in 2011, we got an amendment to our agreement which added an additional 5 acres. So we're currently the largest farm in the city of Detroit. We grow more than 37 different crops. My favorite of which is kale. I have to admit to you, I never ate kale until I was a grown man. Only greens I had growing up was collards, mustards, and turnips. I didn't know nothing about no kale. And then one day I discovered it, and I fell in love. That's my very favorite vegetable now. So, but in fact, these are some of the kales that we grow, the kind of traditional curly leaf kale that people are used to seeing. And we have the Masanano or dinosaur kale also that I've come to love. So we grow lots and lots of salad greens. We grow, traditional crops that people are used to seeing: tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet potatoes, all kinds of stuff. We also do composting. We grow organically. We're concerned not just again about food access, but we're concerned about our relationship with the earth, and we're concerned about reestablishing a style of farming that really contributes to the health of the earth instead of taking away. And clearly the industrial food system that provides the vast majority of our food today does great harm to the earth. And so one of the things that we have to be concerned about is making the earth sustainable. You know, what about the generations that are coming after us? We don't want to just ruin it. And again, this is part of what happens in a system of unbridled capitalism when people are only concerned about profit in the here and now. They just rape the land. Let's get as much as we can right now and don't worry about what happens in the future. But we know that, you know, from the culture of the native peoples who were in this land prior to Europeans coming, that it's wise to think 7 generations forward. And that we have to understand within, you know, much of what I've studied is African culture. I've studied ancient African philosophical frameworks, and one of the things those frameworks have suggested to me is that we're part of this kind of circle of life, that we're tied to our ancestors. You know, in fact, if we look at our faces, you know, our ancestors come to mind because they're in our bloodstream. Many of the things that we do that we might think we're doing of our own volition, we're doing because there's some ancestral compulsion to do that. That there was some tendency that perhaps your great-grandfather had that's been passed down to you. But we're also tied to those who haven't been born yet. And so they'll continue to share our bloodstream. And so that's part of this idea of the African circle of life. And so we have to be concerned about sustainable practices, not just about ourselves in the here and now. So we do composting as part of our effort to be sustainable. We don't use any kind of chemicals at our farm, no artificial fertilizers. Compost is the only way that we fertilize our crops. So we started out actually with this small style of composting using old pallets. And those were our first 2 compost bins. We would bring food scraps from our house and put them in there, and cardboard and leaves and all kinds of things, and make this really rich compost. But in 2011, we started a large-scale composting operation as a result of our partnership with Will Allen and Growing Power in Milwaukee. And so Will Allen challenged us to create this large-scale composting operation, and we got an agreement with the local food rescue operation that goes around the supermarkets and it collects food that is outdated. And some of that food is still able to be consumed by human beings, and that food is donated to food banks. But some of that food is beyond consumption. And so the food which is beyond consumption is delivered to our farm twice a week. And we have about 15 pallets per delivery that comes. Each pallet is about 800 pounds of food, so you can kind of do the math and see the scale that we're doing this on. And then we have an agreement with the local county forestry department. They bring wood chips to us, which we use for our carbon source, and we combine the nitrogen from the food waste and the carbon from the wood chips to produce this compost. And we pile it up in the piles that are about 6-8 feet tall. We use a tractor to turn the piles every 3 weeks or so. Then after a few months, we have this really rich humus that we use to restore fertility to the soil. We also have a mushroom growing operation where we're growing about 4 different types of mushrooms. We have 8 beehives that we're using for pollination of the crops and also for the production of honey. And we do lots and lots and lots of agritourism. We have thousands of people who visit our farm. And so our farm is not just a production farm, but it's also an educational institution where we're exposing people to the various techniques that can be used in urban agriculture. And for many young people in Detroit, visiting our farm is really their first exposure to a farm. And not just young people. You know, last year we had, in fact, every year for the last 3 years, we've had a group of law students from the University of Michigan who come out and visit our farm and do a service day. And so last year I was kind of shocked because I asked the law students how many people have been to a farm before. And one of the guys, that was his very first time being on a farm. And so again, we have this real disconnect between where we live and where our food is grown. And so we're consciously bridging that divide through what we call agritourism. I mentioned earlier that for African people of African descent in particular, we often have a negative view of agriculture based on our history. And, you know, I could really do a whole talk just about food and the period of our enslavement, but I'll say just a couple of things about that in the interest of brevity. First, I want to say that people are not often aware. People are aware that thousands and thousands of Africans were captured in West Africa and brought to the Western Hemisphere, to places like what we now call the United States of America, places like Jamaica, places like Brazil, places like Cuba, and that they provided free labor for the plantation system, and also for mines. It wasn't just growing food, but it was largely growing food. In places like Jamaica, gold was mined and was sent back to Spain. But this large-scale agricultural production was largely based on the free labor that enslaved Africans provided. So most of us know that. But what we often don't think about is that if you're transporting 300 or 400 Africans across the Atlantic Ocean on a trip that takes 4 to 6 weeks, that you have to have a tremendous amount of food stored on that ship to feed those captives. And so initially, the enslavers started bringing food from Europe. And if you know anything about the slave trade, they often call it the triangular slave trade, because the ships would start in Europe, come down to the west coast of Africa, then come across the Atlantic Ocean, then go back to Europe. And so initially, the enslavers started bringing food from Europe, and then they have to wait in the port in West Africa, and they found that often the food would spoil as they were waiting for enough Africans to be captured to fill up the ship before it could depart. Then they also found out that the Africans didn't like the food they were bringing from Europe and often would reject it. And so they were having a high death rate. And so they started buying food locally in West Africa. And they would buy foods that could be easily stored on these ships, such as yams, or rice, or sorghum. And by buying these foods, it really changed the food economy of these societies in West Africa, because instead of growing food for themselves in the neighboring villages, they started growing food for the corporations that were running the slave ships. So that's one aspect of it, how the slave trade changed the food economy of West Africa. That's not often talked about. But another aspect of it is that when the ships got to the Western Hemisphere, they would often have food stocks left over. So, in the case of rice, for example, the commercial cultivation of rice began in South Carolina, using rice that came over on these ships from West Africa. But not only did the rice come from West Africa, but the plantation owners started realizing that there were these highly developed rice cultures in West Africa, people who knew how to grow rice and knew how to create the irrigation systems. So then they started targeting their enslavement and started targeting the villages that grew rice in order to get people to have the specific skills that they needed for the production of rice in South Carolina. And so this is an untold story, or it's not untold, but it's not widely known. There's a book I would highly recommend that you pick up, which is called Black Rice by Judith Carney, C-A-R-N-E-Y, who happens to be a white woman from Detroit, actually. And I'm looking forward to meeting her. I'm supposed to be on a panel with her in April in Madison, Wisconsin. But the book was very eye-opening for me. But she also has a second book, which is called In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy to the Atlantic World. And then she really expands on some of the things she talked about in the book Black Rice, because not only did rice come across, but many, many crops came across, and animals came as well. The animals were primarily to feed the ship's crew, but they brought goats and cattle as well. So many people don't know that the cattle that were used to start the cattle industry in Brazil were longhorn cattle that the Fulani raised in West Africa. And the same thing happened. They began to go and target the groups who raised cattle and enslave them and bring them to Brazil in order to build Brazil's cattle industry. So there's a lot to this story. So I just want to give you a couple of references to do further research on your own. But back to this point, that because of the experience of enslavement, and then after formal slavery was over, of course, the dominant system in the South was sharecropping, and there were various other forms of tenant farming that developed. And so for many black people, when we start talking about agriculture, this is the only lens that we have to view it from. And some poor whites too, it's not just black folks, some poor whites, they don't have anything to do with farming now. And so part of our work is to reframe this work as an honorable work, because in American society, farmers no longer are honored. You know, I had the opportunity to travel to Mali about 10 years ago, and that was before the current kind of upheaval that's going on in Mali. But a small group of us were traveling in a van, about 7 of us were traveling in a van from Bamako, the capital city, to the lands in the highlands where the Dogon people live. And we saw an elder sitting in front of a kind of a mud structure on the side of the road. We said, well, let's stop and let's just talk to him. And you know, when you're traveling in a small group, you can do that. That's why I like traveling in smaller groups. I don't like being on big tour buses. In fact, sometimes when you're on tour buses, you got some people that are kind of whack too. And you see, really, you know, you've heard that term, the ugly Americans. Travel out of this country with a large group of people, you'll see, you know, like I've been in Ghana, for example. We were on a large bus, no, Senegal, I'm sorry. And one of the people on the bus, a black woman from Detroit, said, there were children coming up just trying to sell us things. She said, they can't even speak English. So anyway, I prefer traveling in smaller groups with people that don't have that kind of mentality. But one of the advantages of traveling in a smaller group is that you can stop and you can talk to people. So we stopped on the side of the road and we talked to this elder in a village. The ethnic group is called the Bobo people. And we talked to him for a while, and near the conclusion of our conversation with him, he told us, you have to go over there across the road and greet the farmer. And he said the reason you have to greet the farmer is because it's those who work in the sun who make it possible for those who work in the shade. It's those who work in the sun who make it possible for those who work in the shade. And that's really stuck with me. And what it implied is that he really understood the role that farmers play in sustaining the whole society. And so we have to bring the honor back to farming, and that's part of the work of our organization, particularly among African people. To reframe this work as a work of self-determination, not as a work to advance somebody else, but as a work to lift up ourselves and our own communities. And so that's a very important part of the work that we do. I'm going to move quickly because I'm getting a signal that I only have a few minutes left. Another important part of the work that we've done is policy development. We created the Detroit Food Policy Council. We were the lead organization, I should say, in creating, because many other people contributed, but we led the work. And we wrote a food policy for the city of Detroit that we got the city council to unanimously adopt in March of 2008. It addresses those areas. You can go online and look up the Detroit Food Policy Council. .net, www.detroitfoodpolicycouncil.net. You can get a copy of the entire policy. The Detroit Food Policy Council has 21 members that represent various sectors of the food system. We wanted everybody to be there at the table together. Producers, retailers, distributors, growers, and consumers. So we also designated 6 seats for Detroit's grassroots community because we want to make sure that Detroit's population is represented in the Food Policy Council. The Food Policy Council does several things, including implementing and monitoring the food policy. We produce an annual Detroit Food System report. I have about 6 copies of that left if anybody would like one, of our latest report that just came out about a month ago. We have a weekly column that we do in a local newspaper called Food is Life. We sponsor an annual Powering Up the Local Food System Summit. And then we have work groups that the community can participate in order to play a role in transforming the local food system. We also participate in this effort called Uprooting Racism and Planting Justice. And I won't spend a lot of time on that. I already kind of talked about that. We started out calling ourselves the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, but really, as our consciousness has evolved, we realized that what we're really supporting is food sovereignty. And so food sovereignty is really the ability of communities to define their own food system, not just having enough food. In fact, my friend Raj Patel says that you can have food security in prison, right? You can be in prison and have enough to eat. So we want something much more profound than that. We want to be able to define the the food system which provides our food, and define what foods we consume and under what conditions those foods are produced. Our sister was telling me that she's concerned about GMOs, right? We're concerned about that too. So we don't just want to have enough access to food and the food is grown, with genetically modified organisms. We want to define the food system that impacts our lives. These are some of the principles of food sovereignty put forth by an international organization called Via Campesina. And I won't go through all of those, you can read them, but I will say just a little on the first one, that food is a basic human right. That we stand firmly on that regardless of your station in life, regardless of your economic status, that as the result of being a human being on this earth, you have the human right to have access to good, healthy, clean, affordable food. You also, as a human being on this earth, have the right to have access to good, clean water. We should not compromise on that. We should demand those things for all of humanity. We should not accept the condition. In fact, it's vulgar and profane that in a society as wealthy as the United States that we have anybody who is hungry. It's criminal. So we have to demand this. We have to demand this of our local, county, and federal governments, that hunger be eliminated, that all human beings have the right to have adequate amounts of food. Embedded within this